Now for the second scripture passage as it comes to us from the prophecy of Isaiah, the 35th chapter. I'm reading one single verse, verse 7. Listen for God's holy word. The burning sand will become a pool, and the thirsty ground fountains of water. The jackal's habitat, a pasture, grass will become reeds and rushes. God's holy word. The people of Israel are familiar with the wilderness. As they were moving from Egypt to the promised land, they had 40 years of training in wilderness survival. The wilderness was a hot, arid, rough place to travel. Even more difficult to live for 40 years before the promises of God will be realized in their own life. The people of Israel, then in the pages of the Old Testament and today, are familiar with wilderness survival. Those in this congregation who will be traveling to Israel in September will discover once you arrive that the rough, arid, parched land of the wilderness makes its way up to the very gates of Jerusalem. The people of Israel understand what it's like to live in the midst of the wilderness. The wilderness has taught them much. Their culture has been influenced by it. Their literature is haunted by it. And the wilderness has colored their theology. The people of Israel then and now have become familiar with life in the wilderness. What we share with Israel today is that we are also making our way through a wilderness. Our wilderness is the unkind rhetoric of politics that we are confronted with every day. We are in the midst of a wilderness of an uncertain economy, and we are in a wilderness where people are experiencing loneliness at a scale never realized before, and mental illness seeks to consume so many people. We are in our own wilderness, and there is much that we can learn from the people of Israel who have been trained in wilderness survival. The people of Israel will tell you that the worst thing about being in the wilderness, the greatest curse of being in the wilderness, is the mirage. You're in a hot, desolate place. You've been traveling for some time. You are tired, you are weary, you are thirsty, and then suddenly you see right there in front of you large palm trees offering shade and rest, and a large pool of water that promises to quench your thirst. And you struggle forward. You struggle forward and you struggle forward, trying to reach the cool living waters, only to discover that as you advance forward, it seems to go further out until it begins to break up and disappear altogether. The cruelest part of making your way through a wilderness is the mirage, that there's refreshment just ahead of you. And the people of Israel will tell you that the cruelest of all mirages is the mirage of the heart. For you see, the people of Israel were told by God through Moses that their time of bondage had come to an end, and that God was going to take them out of Egypt and take them to a promised land, that they will experience freedom from bondage, where they will be able to worship as they pleased, and they could engage in building a nation that would be their own nation. It was a promise that excited the heart, and it stirred the passions and the energies of the people of Israel as they made their way out of Egypt into the wilderness on the way to the promised land. Except year after year, after yet another year and another year of traveling in the wilderness, the promises of God seemed to become a mirage of the heart. It seemed like they would never get there. Anytime they were excited that they were about to enter into the promised land, the mirage had disappeared in the heat, the simmering heat of the wilderness. And they became discouraged. Recently in the New Yorker magazine, there is a cartoon of the people of Israel in the wilderness following Moses. Moses is leading and they are following in somewhat of a single file line, and the cartoon depicts them going this way and then this way and then this way and then this way, and what we see is the people of Israel are muttering and they're saying, recalculating, 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 recalculating. Disillusionment sometimes results in sarcasm. And the people of God became disillusioned as they were making their way through the hot, arid land of the wilderness. But most often, when we are in the wilderness, we're overwhelmed and we feel that the mirages are only that, and that there are no promises ahead of us, and we feel crushed. The people of Israel were so crushed, they asked Moses to take them back to Egypt. They had the audacity to say that being slaves in Egypt, where we had a home to live in and food to eat, is far better than being here in the wilderness. Disillusionment crushed their spirits, and they could no longer hold on to the promise that God had something better for them than bondage in Egypt. And disillusionment can crush our spirit as well. I do not know, but I do suspect that the reason we're seeing so many suicides in this country is that people are crushed by disillusionment. And the author of Psalm 73 puts it this way: "O Lord, I have walked the straight and the narrow. I have been true to your word. I have lived as you have asked me to live, and I've done all that you've asked me to do. And yet the wicked seem to flourish, and I am being crushed every day. Oh God, are your promises nothing more than a mirage in the wilderness?" And this is when the prophet Isaiah this morning says, no. Isaiah answers the people of Israel who are asking, are the promises of God a mirage? Absolutely not. They are not a mirage. They may appear to be a mirage from time to time. It may be that you have to struggle forward a little longer, but God's promises are certain, and the day will come when you will see palm trees that will give you shade and rest, and there will be a pool of living water, and you will drink deeply from these waters. It is not a mirage. Isaiah says, I know what disillusionment is. I've experienced it with you. It can be crushing, but every time that I have felt that life has come to an end for me, every time I've been disappointed or discouraged in life, I've looked back on those moments and I've seen evidence that God was with me every step of the way. It is not a mirage. God's promises can be trusted. And when you're hot and you're tired and you're thirsty, know God is right there with you. When you feel that life has come to an end and that the promises will never be realized in your life, God is still present with you. What you have is God. When you don't have those things that you want, you still have God. Some years ago, when I had the opportunity to study for a semester in London, England, I was told this story, a true story, that during the Second World War, a man's heart grew large for the children who are now orphans because of the war in London. Children who had lost both of their parents because of the war with Germany. And so he took all the resources that he had to purchase a building in the city of London. Those resources were not enough. So he had to go to one person after another person, after another person, after another person, and ask for whatever donation they could make. Anything that you can give so that I can purchase this building and renovate it and turn it into a home for these children who have no parents and who have no home. He wanted to provide for them a shelter where they could eat and be loved. And after much work and much fundraising, he was able to purchase a building and have it renovated for dozens upon dozens of children who now had no home and had no parent. He adopted them and he loved them deeply. Until one night the sirens went off to alert all of London that Hitler's bombers were now overhead. He was able to get every single child into a bomb shelter safely. But the home was utterly destroyed by Hitler's bombs. The next morning when the bombing had ceased, he came out of the shelter and he went to the site once occupied by the home he built. And he began to sob. And in his sobs, he fell to his knees and he began to cry out. It is all gone. It is all lost. Everything is gone. The dream is absolutely gone. When suddenly he became aware that all the children that he had brought together in this home had now come out of the bomb shelter and they had surrounded him and they said, "No, it's not all gone. You still have us." And what Isaiah wants to say to us, that when we feel that it is all gone, or that we will never achieve what it is that we're looking for, we still have God. But it is easy for us in our faith to become discouraged even about that. To believe that God is present when we cannot sense God's presence or God's activity in our life. I want to remind you of Good Friday. The people of Israel had cast their hopes upon Jesus Christ. That finally the mirage was becoming true. That in Jesus Christ we saw the certainty of God's kingdom coming to this earth. People had cast their hopes for the future in this man Jesus Christ, only to see him nailed to the cross and to take his last breath, to be removed from the cross and placed into the tomb, and the tomb sealed with a large stone. And God was absolutely silent. And the disciples huddled together in fear. Had they wasted 3 years following Jesus Christ? Why isn't God speaking to them? And the darkness of disillusionment surrounded them for the rest of the day Friday. Saturday was no different. It was the longest day of their life, all day wondering, had their hopes come to naught? Not a word of encouragement, not a word of hope from Almighty God. And the disillusionment was suffocating. But we know what happened on Easter morning. And what the disciples discovered, and what we discover, is that in the time that it seemed that God was absolutely quiet, God was doing God's best work, preparing to raise Christ from the dead, never to die again. The people in the wilderness believe that all their hopes and their dreams are nothing more than mirage, that nothing can be counted on again. And Isaiah says, no, it is not true, that it's only a mirage. God is present. God is with you. And God will lead you to satisfying waters. Just wait upon the Lord. Do not let go of God, because God has not let go of you. But it is so difficult to believe in a God that we do not see present in our life, isn't it? A woman this morning shared with me that she has just returned from Italy. Her daughter gave her a trip to Italy and how much it meant to her. I hope to go to Italy one day. I am told that within certain Christian circles in Italy, there is a story that is told. It is a story now that's told outside of Italy and other parts of Europe. Every effort to verify this story has failed. It is simply a story that may be true or it may not. But friends, it is a story that I choose to believe. A story I choose to believe because if it is not true, it absolutely could have happened. The story is this, is that there was a merchant one day, a very wealthy merchant, who had heard about the miraculous works of the Apostle Paul. And he wanted to meet Paul face to face. But he didn't know how to do that. And one day he was traveling in the course of business in Rome when he learned that Paul was now in prison in Rome. And he knew that Timothy was a friend of Paul, and so he found Timothy. And he asked Timothy, would you orchestrate a face-to-face meeting with the Apostle Paul? I've heard of his wondrous works. I want to meet this great man. So Timothy orchestrated a meeting between this merchant and Paul in Paul's prison cell there in Rome. And do you know that when this merchant entered the prison cell, he saw a man considerably older than he expected to see, who was frail and weak and bent over. But what he also found was that there was a strength and a magnetism about this man, Paul. He visited with Paul for several hours, and before he left, he asked for Paul's blessings upon him, and Paul gave it. When he left the prison cell with Timothy, he asked Timothy, what is the secret to this man's power? Never before have I seen a man of such age, of such frailty, bent over by life. And yet there's a power and a magnetism about it. What is the source of Paul's power? And Timothy smiled and said, Paul's in love. In love? Yes. Paul's in love with Jesus Christ. Is that all? Timothy continued to smile and say, yes, that is all, but it is enough. You see, Paul loves Jesus so deeply that disillusionment is scattered. It cannot occupy 1 square inch of his prison cell, because Paul's love for Jesus Christ is so strong that even when he does not hear from God, it never diminishes his love for Jesus. When God seems quiet, Paul chose to love, and to love deeply, and that was enough. Disillusionment surrounds the world. It surrounds this nation. It may be surrounding you right this moment. But what we can do is acknowledge that Christ died for us, that Christ was raised for us, that Christ lives for us, and to love Jesus Christ so deeply that as we do so, disillusionment is scattered, and we believe that the promises of God will be fulfilled in our life. It is not a mirage. Answers Isaiah. We will drink deeply of the living waters that are Jesus Christ. We had a very successful VBS this week. Daniel is here this morning. And Greg Rapier played Aspenaz, a servant of the king of Babylon. I wish you could have seen your associate pastor, Greg. He took his role very seriously. Once he put on the costume of Aspenaz, he became Aspenaz. He did not step out of character once as long as he was dressed as Aspenaz, the servant of the king of Babylon. If you read Daniel, you'll learn that Aspenaz does not believe in God. And so Monday, at the beginning of VBS, I was walking through the Center for Christian Studies with a little girl in our congregation who was participating in Vacation Bible School, and Greg was trying out his new character and looked squarely at her and said, "I do not believe in God." And she, 11 years old, placed her hands on her hip, looked squarely at Greg and said, "Well, I do." And then continued to walk on. May that be so for you and for me. Amen.